Hello everybody, Bob Lusk, the Pond Boss, coming at you live from my pickup. I'm perched on a hill in a real pastoral, beautiful setting in Washington County, Texas. Not far from Washington on the Brazos, between Navasota and Brenham. Washington on the Brazos, interestingly enough, was where Texas' first government was formed back in 1835 when we were a republic, as we probably should be again. Let's see, Todd Austin. I see Todd. I see Austin Bennett. We got the two Austins in. Cool. Good to see you guys. I was talking to Debbie, my wife, a couple days ago, and I said, honey, what do you think about a topic? What kind of an idea do you have for a topic for the show? And she said, I saw something kind of fun. I see Robbie Shell. There's Rob. Mike Cottrell. Let's see, I saw somebody else. Yeah, okay. I know it shows 17 folks viewing, but I don't know who all is there unless, I don't know how it works. There's Drew Hay checking in from Pennsylvania. Dion Myers, good to see Dion. But anyway, I was talking to Debbie, and I had just kicked on the water well. I'm sure your ponds are evaporating at pretty fast rates right now. Bob Mayer, good to see Bob. And what happens is evaporation this time of year in Texas and probably in other places. There's Willie Howell and Never. Next door neighbor Willie checking in. But evaporation rates right now when the temperature is way up. Hey Dion, what's going on? Matt Rail's checking in. One of the true celebrities in the pond management business right there. Matt Rail, good to see Matt. Anyway, our evaporation rates right now where the temperatures are in the upper 90s. Matter of fact, we've hit 100, I think 4 days in a row and up in North Texas. And the humidity's been around 40 to 50%. When the humidity's there, a pond evaporates almost half an inch a day. Now, keep in mind that 1 acre, 1 inch deep is 27,000 gallons. So you guys can do the math and figure out how much water actually goes away. There's Chris Blood checking in from Texas Hunter. I got some Texas Hunter feeders in the other day, got them up and going. I say the other day, probably 6 weeks ago, and got them feeding fish. Water temperature 89 degrees at Fred Bingham's place. Chuck Brinkman, Travis Paul Smith. Chuck, I'm doing fine. Thanks for asking. 89 degrees at the surface. Well, where I was going with this is at 1 acre, 1 inch deep is 27,000 gallons. You can do the math. If you lose half an inch of water a day off of your 2 acre pond, you're losing 27,000 gallons. There's Harrison Davis checking in from Georgia. So, hey, you guys know that I'm kind of out in my truck and not where I usually am. Pond Boss magazine, there it is. There's the July-August issue. It's hitting the mailboxes. Matter of fact, most everybody that gets it in the mail has gotten it. I'm kind of close uppity here. There's Clark Cole checking in from Weatherford, Texas. If you guys will click like, share this video to your timeline, and put in hashtag Pond Boss Magazine in the comments section, you're eligible for a drawing for a hat, a Pond Boss hat, and a mug. Look at there, Skoogman. There's Bruce Condello. Skoog says, does high humidity reduce the amount of evaporation? Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Travis Paul Smith, Texas Hunter feeders are full of Aquamax MVP. That's our go-to feed. Skoog, I'll come back to that. There's Josie. I see Josie checking in. She's probably hanging out with Wayne. I know there are two couples on date night tonight watching the show, which is kind of funny to me. I love it. I think it's pretty cool. Yes. Hey, Hall of Famer. Yeah, there you go. I love that. Hi there from mid-Michigan. Still looking for my magazine, The Mail Guy Shirley. You know what? Honest to gosh, a few years ago, I'll tell you what, we put the magazine in plastic bags. Of course, we got scolded about that from a guy in Oregon, but we started putting them in plastic bags because they would either some would get torn up through the mailing process, but we did have several mail people that would read the magazine and keep it for a week before they delivered it, which I thought that was great. Vito Barnes has got it. Hashtag Pond Boss Magazine. Yep, Bob's in a Chevy Silverado. That's right. So anyway, going back to the humidity question, look at air like a sponge. It's going to absorb as much water as it can. That's where clouds come from. Clouds don't just show up. They start off at the ground and they go up. From water sources, whether it's the ocean or the bays or lakes or our ponds. And the higher the evaporation rate is, the lower the humidity rate is. So humidity absolutely does have an impact on how much evaporation occurs. Travis loves the new look. That's great. John Funk got it. Connor Osaski, got to see you. Okay, so I got two topics I want to talk about tonight. Of course, we'll hit your question as much as we can. Holy cow, thunderstorm warning now at Brownstown, Illinois. May have to head for the basement. Jeez, air temp went from 93 to 77. Good gosh. Yeah, Bruce says, thank God Al Gore invented the internet. That's good. That's pretty funny right there, Bruce. Yep, we thank Al for that every day. Got to get a little sip of water. So the two topics I wanted to hit tonight, and Fred and Connie, Fred, if you need to go to the basement, you better start now. Bill Russell loves the new magazine. Good, I'm glad we got a brand new layout. I appreciate the kind words. We've gotten a lot of really, really kind words. You know, I do want to get on the topic here in a minute, but we do have some, I'm sitting here looking at it, we do have some really, really good stuff. Here's a real important story. There's one in here about, should you take fish from an old pond and move them to a new one? What can I stock to eat bullheads? Largemouth bass will eat bullheads, but almost any kind of predator fish will eat bullheads. Uh-oh, I just lost my comments. Oh, now they're back. Look at there, Ken Dowd, new subscriber, just got my first book. Awesome stuff. Good to hear that. Okay, so I want to tackle two topics. One is fish behavior based on temperature. Because our evaporation rates have been pretty high the last 10 or 12 days, plus we irrigate we have a swimming pond right next to our house. We irrigate the yard and gardens and, you know, wherever we've got a sprinkler system, that water's being sucked out of a pond that's not quite 3/4 of an acre. And good gosh, we've had enough rain this year to keep that pond full. There's a pond above it. And our evaporation rates are now, the pond dropped about 8 inches in about 14, 15 days through there somewhere because we were irrigating out of it plus evaporation. So I kicked on the well. We have a well that spits out about 60 gallons a minute. So I kicked on the well and started pumping some of that cool water in there. And that water wasn't going 4 hours. And Debbie said, hey, come here, look at this. And we stepped outside. She said, look over there, because I've got I designed a cool little waterfall where the water comes out of the well, runs through my vat shed where I keep fish from time to time, flows out there, and then goes down a pipe and over this kind of a cool little 45-degree waterfall where it hits different steps going down, and then it hits the pond. And those fish were just piled up around that fresh water. She said, why are they doing that? And I said, well, honey, fish behave based on the temperature of the water, and our surface temperature the last few days, I mean, we went swimming in it, and it was bath water. Now, I use an aeration system sometimes I don't, especially when I'm trying to learn more about how water behaves top to bottom. So in this case, I've had the aeration system off for about 4 weeks now, and I'm going to kick it back on. But the surface water was in the low 90s, like 90, 91, 92, 93, down to about 2.5 feet. Then below that, it's in the low 80s. So it drops from the 90s where it gets heated through the course of the day into the 80s, and then get on down halfway down where the thermocline sits, and you could feel cold water on your feet. So what I told her was that well water coming in at 65 degrees, that's what fish like. So where I'm going with this topic is that different species of fish have different temperature tolerances and different temperature requirements. I see Darren Wolf, good to see him. John Funk says the water's muddy now thanks to the bullheads. Yeah, bullheads will do that. Bullheads will absolutely muddy the water. Now what happened, now one thing about muddy water, it doesn't get as hot as clear water. Now think about that a minute. Why not? You know, when the water's clear, the sun can penetrate deeper. And when it can penetrate deeper, it can push its warmth deeper. Justin Schenck, nice try. Thanks, man. Woo! All right. Between 87 and 91, Travis Paul Smith watching. Yep, it's so where I'm going is that fish prefer to regulate their metabolism rates if they can based on the temperature of the water. You know, so one of the experiments I like to do is just to see how feeding behavior changes as we get into the summer and see if placement of the feeder makes a difference based on the temperature of the water. And with some species of fish, it does. You know, for example, you guys know from your angling experience that this time of year, fish are in their summer pattern, whatever that means. Well, here's what that means. Bass, especially, in all warm water fish and cold water fish to some extent, seek their perfect temperature. They really like to find the right temperature where their bodies can operate at a peak rate. Like for largemouth bass, for example, that's going to be something between, say, 68 degrees up to about 82 or 83 degrees. So if a bass can find a temperature that sits somewhere in the upper 70s, that's perfect. Bluegill, they can stand the heat. They don't mind being in the water 81, 82, 83 degrees, where bass don't like that at all. Bass are going to try to get cooler. Threadfin shad, on the other hand, they like to have temperatures in the low 80s. That's what they like. Channel catfish, they're nocturnal, but they like to have cool water as well. They'd rather it be in the 70s than in the 80s or 90s, but that doesn't stop them from being quite as active. So all these different species of fish have a little bit different temperature operating metabolism rates. So keep that in mind when you're fishing, and also keep that in mind when you're managing your lake. One key point, I've hit this many times over the years, is that when aeration started coming into our marketplace, we were kind of picky about how we used it because we used it all the time. Well, now what happens is we can see that it can impact fish growth rates. It can impact, fish feeding habits. It can impact the way fish behave when you're fishing for them. So what I tell people now, especially in the southern tier of states where the temperature gets so hot in the daytime and then doesn't cool off that much at night, is to run the aeration system at night to keep that ambient temperature or average temperature down a little bit. So fish behavior is absolutely affected by temperature, even more than oxygen. As long as a fish has the oxygen it needs to breathe and not die, it would much rather go seek a perfect temperature than a perfect oxygen level. Let's see here, I'm going to scroll down. I got to look at my phone here. Let me look at this. I see Jeremy Duckworth. Justin's got a question. Let me see here. Brian Lee Baker, am I sure about that? I'm not sure what you're asking me, but yeah, if I'm not sure about it, I'm probably not going to say it. Leslie Love, will flathead catfish eat more brim or mudcats if there are plenty of both brim and mudcats in an 83-acre reservoir? Flathead catfish are opportunistic predator fish, and in most environments, they are the top-end predator. I've seen flathead catfish eat a 5-pound bass before. A 35-pound flathead catfish will eat a 5-pound bass. Now, what's got to happen is that bass has got to be in that catfish's territory, or the catfish has got to be actively out seeking food. So flathead catfish, it won't differentiate more between brim or mudcats. It won't. It will eat whatever's available because they're going to eat what they can eat from that opportunity. Let's see. Will aeration affect moss or algae growth? Will it affect temperature locally? The answer to that is I'm going to qualify these answers. The answer is yes. Will it affect temperature locally? Yes. Aeration will affect temperature locally because it's taking heat from the sun and distributing it evenly in the water column. That's why we talk about sometimes aerating like from 9 o'clock at night till 9 in the morning so that you're getting that nighttime temperature wave instead of the daylight temperature wave. Will it affect moss and algae growth? It doesn't affect whether that will grow or not, and it won't kill it. But what it will do, aeration can, by moving the water, can keep nutrients in better suspension to create a better plankton bloom if the timing is right. Now, what I mean by that is once bushy pondweed gains a foothold, you can aerate till the cows come home, and it's not going to uplodge it, dislodge it, uproot it, send it going. It's not going to send it away, and it's going to keep growing. But if you're aerating and you've got a good water movement where you're turning the lake over, once a day or once every day and a half, or even sometimes as much as 2 times a day, you're going to keep the nutrients moving through the water column, which in turn is going to grow more microscopic algae and plankton, things like that, in the basis of the food chain where it can be converted. So that's what I got to say about that. Let's see here. Justin says, I installed a daytime solar aeration system at my 1/3 acre catfish bluegill pond this morning. It was the highlight of my week. Yeah, I know. That's pretty cool. That's great. Look at there. Travis got a neighbor on there. Duckworth, howdy. Todd, Danny Mac. Danny Mac, you got a haircut and a well-trimmed beard. Well, I did get a haircut, but I didn't trim my beard, although Debbie told me to. I didn't get around to it. Ended up hauling her down to Austin and playing with a grandchild. So, look at there. There's, hey, Wayne and Josie, you guys got competition now because Matt and Sarah Mitchell, they're having their date night watching this show, which is hilarious. I love that. Let's see. Bruce says, if you decrease overall plant biomass, will that allow largemouth bass to hammer more bullheads? Absolutely right. Yes, it will. If there's less plant biomass where fish can hide, if you decrease the amount of plant mass, that's going to make more bait fish available to more predator fish, whether they're largemouth, smallmouth, walleye, tiger muskies, crappie, hybrid stripers, whatever they are. So that's absolutely right. Let's see here. Let me go back down here and see what we got here. Okay. I may miss some guys because I'm looking at the phone here. Okay, let's see here. Ken Dowd says, Bob, my 2-acre pond in Pennsylvania is 60% surrounded by trees, but bare of plants all around the edge. Any negatives to planting water iris and arrowhead? No, there's no negatives to that at all. That's actually positives. I'd plant both. I'd plant water iris and arrowhead, especially if you know they're going to grow there in Pennsylvania. There are irises that will grow there, but be picky. Don't buy irises from Louisiana and expect them to do really well in Pennsylvania. So if you've got some local irises or different kinds of bog plants, or wetland plants that you like, those are the ones I would choose. So I'd say yes to that. David Watkins, how do you turn a 15-acre lake over once a day? You're going to have probably a 15-acre lake. I'm going to tell you probably 8 diffusers, which means 2 air compressors. And those diffusers are placed about 2/3 of the way down the total depth of the pond. And if you'll go to pondboss.com and go to the resource guide, and look at the aeration system companies, almost every one of them that we have vetted and that we love will design a system for you based on the size and depth of your lake. So you can turn a 15-acre lake over once a day. So let's see here. Matt Mitchell says, we have not had rain in Indiana, central Indiana, for over 2 months. It's really hot and dry out there. I tell you what, one of my favorite phrases to tell people is, if you're not in a drought, you will be. And I'd plan for that. I would expect it, even though when it happens, you're really not expecting it. Now, every single drought, everyone, listen to this, ends with a flood. Normal rains don't stop droughts. It takes a flood. So, when we're talking about water temperatures, I think this is something that's really important to know. I don't want to dwell on this a minute, Mike or Matt. That's a good question. When you are in a drought, think about this. When we have and right now we're at peak evaporation rates, and we're going to be there, July, August, and some of September. We're going to be at our peak evaporation rates for the entire year. Now, keep in mind, in the wintertime, you have evaporation rates then too. Of course, that's how ice can leave a roadway and the temperature not be above freezing. I think they call it sublimation is the word for that. But where I'm going is that when you have a 2-acre pond that drops 2 feet, that's probably half the volume of the water that's gone, and so let's see here. Something's going on. I better look. So when that water evaporates, everything that's dissolved in the water increases in concentration. So let's say, for example, that you've got 100 parts per million total alkalinity, which is calcium carbonate. Let's say that's what you've got. If you lose half the volume of water, that 100 parts per million goes to 200 parts per million. And if you lose half the volume again, it goes to 400 parts per million. And then when you do get that flooding rain, it's going to dilute all those different factors, all the different metals and minerals, and organic matter that's dissolved in the water. That's all going to get diluted, and that's another reason to really be looking at aeration, so you can keep the water autonomous and keep the water chemistry stable. Because when you do get those flooding rains, you need to be ready for it. And one of the things I tell people that are in a drought, about twice a year, check your water chemistry so you can see the comparisons. You can see, what the concentrations are becoming. You can see what your alkalinity is. You can see what your salts are. You can learn that and pay attention to it. Now, I'm not telling you there's going to be anything you can do about it, but there might be. If you see your alkalinity go from 0 to forever, it might be feasible. If you've lost 2/3 of the volume of your water, you can buffer that alkalinity by adding some acid. You can decrease it. Now, I don't recommend that very often because we don't come across this situation very often, but it's at least worthy of some thought. Now it's holy cow, it's already 6:50. I do want to talk about bass genetics. I got a call yesterday. It was pretty interesting. Let me scroll down here a minute. Connor says, preserve bluegill genetics in less than 1 acre ponds or stock bluegill by green sunfish to coincide with your stunted bass populations. So it looks like Connor is answering a question rather than asking one. Mike says, best treatment for suspended dirty water, and will channel cat cause a muddy pond? Channel cat, they're nocturnal, but they're not really bottom feeders. Some people think channel cat, a lot of people think channel cat are bottom feeders. They're not. They're predator fish. A 2.5 pound channel cat will compete with a 1 pound bass. I've seen all kinds of living meat type stuff in the gut of a channel cat, but the difference is a channel cat is a little bit more opportunistic. It's going to eat what it can. If it has to eat some plants, it'll eat plants, but it's not going to root around in the mud. Now, what it will do is if you've got big numbers of channel cat and you've got them on feed, for example, when they go through that furious flurry of feeding activity, how you like that alliteration there, Bruce, then they will muddy up the water, but it'll typically settle out. If you've got suspended clay and dirty water, it's probably not because of channel cat. Now, it can be because of bullheads. I got some pictures sent to me yesterday from a couple who used to have a clear pond. They had a big fish kill, and then within about 1.5 years, the pond got muddy, stays muddy. I had them go take a jar of water and set it out, and it cleared up overnight. And I had them start feeding some Purina Aquamax, which, by the way, thanks for that sponsorship, Purina. I love Purina. I love their feeds. I love the way they do things. Anyway, I had them start feeding the fish, and they captured some fish in a cast net and sent me a picture of about 15 little carp about that big. So there's no doubt in my mind that their little 2.5, 3 acre pond, the carp are what's muddying up that water there. So let's see here. That was Mike Cottrell's question. Jay Spires, howdy from Charlotte, North Cackalack. Love the new issue of Pond Boss. We are staying safe. Tell you what, I don't know what you guys are doing, but I'm seeing some trends out there that are pretty amazing. I'm seeing a lot of folks who have weekend places but live in the city have vacated the city and have moved to their weekend places until this pandemic is over. As far as Debbie and I, we're being very cautious and careful, and I don't go anywhere where I don't know people. And if I pull up to a store and there's more than about 10 or 15 cars in the parking lot, I'm not going in. Not worth it. So we try to budget our time and figure things out. So anyway, thanks. Yep. Josie's in Austin. Wayne's in New Jersey. Yep. Danny Mac's back on. Let's see here. Jason Jones installed a new feeder this summer on our lake. Starting to get a lot of utilization for bluegill and catfish. Last night was 14 soft-shelled turtles eating the fish food. Whoa, that's crazy. Is that too many mouths to feed? If you think it is, it is. Turtles, and I've never seen soft-shelled turtles that much eating fish food. I see a lot of mud turtles and painted turtles and sliders and things like that. I see them come to the fish food, but I don't see the soft-shelled turtles. But if you got them, well, heck, you might want to eat them later. What better way to feed them than to feed them a good fish food? And speaking of that, thanks to Texas Hunter. I appreciate Texas Hunter for their sponsorship. David Schnaderman with Easy Docs. I don't know if he's on tonight or not. But look here, Pond Boss Magazine. We'll put in a little commercial. $35 a year. You guys know what I'm going to say. Cheaper than a Friday night date, and it lasts a year. In this case, maybe a Wednesday night date. I don't know. Hey, and the drawing, Pond Boss hat, Pond Boss mug, know how to keep hot things hot and cold things too, cold things cold. So if you would hashtag Pond Boss Magazine in the comments section, click like, share it to your timeline, then you're eligible for that drawing. And I'm going to get into talking about Florida bass genetics here in just a second. The best way to measure pH and alkalinity for private pond managers, Jeff Thompson's asking that. I tell you what I do. Texas A&M Soil Sciences Lab has got a great water chemistry analysis. $40. They'll check all kinds of parameters and give you a good reference for where you are at that point in time. And I use that. I use that a lot. Matt Mitchell's down a foot. I mean, you can run the math on that. Let's see. Look at there. Travis Paul Smith got all kinds of, good gosh, Travis must have shared the video. Thanks for doing that. Will routine pool maintenance chemical sets be adequate for a pond? No, it's really not. It can give you a range, whereas a lab can give you specific. You know, I tell you this, a pool kit can give you a range of accuracy, but it doesn't measure all the parameters that you'd like to know about your pond. Let's see, Danny Mack says, to give an idea how to dump my 5-year-old swim pool water, it would increase your hair hardness. Was off the scale. Okay, so let's see. Wouldn't read more than 600. Okay, so Danny Mack's using his water from his swimming pool. All right, David Watkins, lost audio visual. Anybody else? I'm wondering if Ken has black walnuts around his pond in Pennsylvania, dealing with that on a... You know what? Hey, that's a good point there, Drew. Hey, I'm glad you said that. If you've got black walnut trees around your pond, there's two things to know about that. Black walnuts, the chemistry of the husk of a black walnut is toxic to plants underneath the tree, but even more importantly, it's toxic to fish. Northern Native Americans years ago figured out that they could take walnuts and crush up the husks of a walnut before it's ripe and drag it through a pond. It would kill the fish, or a stream where they could get the fish. Let's see, there's Ronnie Carroll, Robert Hudson. Haven't been able to fertilize my 2-acre pond due to high flow rates this year and a half. Let's see here, what's this? Will implementing a good bluegill feeding program and supplementing forage for bass with crawfish still produce a productive pond without fertilizing? I'm in Middle Georgia. Yes, it will. Now, you're not going to... Purina's Aquamax MVP is as complete a fish food as I know about. And, Bruce made a point the other day about fish food where in order to make it float, they have to add carbohydrates. Well, predator fish don't digest carbohydrates. A largemouth bass, when it eats a bluegill, there's no wheat flour in a bluegill at all. There's no grain in a bluegill at all. But what you can do by feeding, if you want to be more aggressive with your feeding program and then being selective and also feeding some smaller feeds, you can buy fish foods at different pellet sizes or different morsel sizes. And if you like what Chuck Brinkman does, Chuck's on here every week. Chuck feeds his little bitty bluegills in the summertime with in the springtime with fry starter. So that's pretty good stuff. Let's see, Micah Jefferson, what are your thoughts on stocking Scuds? I love Scuds. If you can get your hands on Scuds and there's good food sources for Scuds, do it. Scuds are stunningly good, high protein, quality forage, especially for bluegills and little bass. Craig Reisner, sometimes I find worms, little orange worms in my fish. What causes them? What those little orange worms are typically grubs. And you find those in ponds that have a lot of aquatic plants. You find where the primary host are snails. So if you've got habitat for snails, you've got habitat for grubs, and you're going to have them. One of the ways that we mitigate the damage from those, now, nobody wants to eat a fillet that's got a worm in it. That's just unappetizing. I'm going to tell you it's okay, and I've done it. I just didn't tell anybody. But if you want to make those grubs go away, take away one of their hosts. And the best way to get rid of the host is to get rid of snails, red ear sunfish, and pumpkin seeds in northern waters will eat those snails. Let's see here. Stephen Martin, hey, Pond Boss, I'm having a pond dig at my new house in a few weeks. What tips can you give me on depth or size here in Wichita, Kansas? I'll tell you what, Stephen, you want water to be at least, I'm going to tell you, 15 feet deep in the deepest end. You want 3-to-1 slopes going down all the way to the bottom if you can, except where you got some ridges for fish habitat. One of the things I would do is buy Mike Otto's book, Just Add Water.
This vehicle is connected by OnStar to limited services.
Uh-oh. My truck's talking to me. I'm not going to talk back, though. So, depth and size. The size is related to the watershed. So however many acres you've got that are feeding that, and you can figure that out on a topo map. If you need some help, drop me a note, and I'll help you go through that. Also, the NRCS locally there in Wichita can help you with that. Let's see. Mark Hicks. What is the good depth of a pond to safely grow hybrids, white bass by stripers? I would guess that they would do better in a deeper pond. Yes, they would do better in a deeper pond. Now, here's the thing about wipers or hybrid striped bass is they don't like hot water. So if you catch one this time of year, get it in fast, release it fast. Now, if you're really, really, really passionate about hybrid stripers and you want to take care of them, you can create a little ICU unit in a cooler by putting pure oxygen through a diffuser into that, which I'm not going to talk about that here. If somebody wants to know about that, email me and I'll tell you about it. And I might write a story about Palm Boss or about it in Palm Boss. Just now back from church, checking in from Southwest Georgia. There's Scott Sumner checking in. Danny Mac, pool water hardness after 5 years was to reflect the impact of evaporation. Ooh, I better watch it. Don't want to knock this thing over. Yep, I see what you're saying. Kyle McKean's checking in. Mark Hicks from Central North Carolina. Jacob West. Stephen, answer good. WC Thermer's checking in. He's in Kansas. Danny Mack, biggest bluegill yet, 14 ounces, but had some red bumps, about 6 on one side. You might want to medicate the feed. Marvin Dooley, growing memories from Southland Fisheries. That a boy, good stuff. That's a good way to get it in there, buddy. All right. Let's see. Good gosh, Travis, you got all kinds of family and friends checking in. Okay, I want to talk about genetics for a few minutes before I got to cut out of here and go be with grandkids again. I got a call yesterday from a man, Jack Bell from Denton, Texas, and I hope Jack's watching because I promised him I'd talk about this. His question to me was, I've got a 2.5 acre pond that has been stocked for 6 years. We electrofished it in year 3, and we're going to electrofish it again in year 6. He says, I've got a pond management company that comes out to manage aquatic plants and make sure the feeders are full because I don't really want to mess with that, and I pay them to do it. He said, but our biggest bass up until this year was 6 pounds, and that's after we're in our 6th year. He said, this year I caught a bass about 8.5 pounds. I just don't think they're growing fast enough to suit me. So we started talking a little bit about bass genetics. His question to me was, should I buy some Florida bass fingerlings and stock into that 2.5 acre pond? Well, as I started thinking about it, the answer to that is no. Don't do that. Now, there are reasons to do that, but I'm going to take you through a couple of scenarios first, and I want you guys to help drill down into this with your questions. Think about this a little bit. So when we first built a pond, and to give you a little bit more backstory, Mr. Bell has just built a 4.5 acre pond, and he stocked it with fathead minnows. It's 4.5 acres. Here's what he stocks: 60 pounds of fathead minnows, 2,400 bluegill fingerlings, and I think he said 500 red ear sunfish fingerlings. And this pond just filled up this spring. Matter of fact, I don't think it's totally full yet. It's within a couple of feet of being full. So his question was, to me, with this 2.5 acre pond, should I add some more Florida genes to that pond? Because I'm not sure that I got the best genes. So here's where I want to go with that. I'm going to start off with the 2.5 acre pond, then I'm going to circle back to the brand new pond. That 2.5 acre pond, an 8.5 pound bass after 6 years is not bad. It's really, really pretty good. Now, he told me that he's, I think, 68 years old. So he's one of these guys that doesn't really want to buy green bananas because he doesn't want to wait on them to get ripe. So I get that. So one of the things that I explained to him that everybody needs to know is you can go, whether it's Southland Fisheries, American Sport Fish Hatchery, Owens and Williams, somebody in Texas, somebody from Florida, Ron Slay, Florida Fish Farms. You can buy the very best genetics of fish that are on the marketplace out there. You can stock them in the water. But let me tell you what's going to happen. There's only going to be a percentage of those that can excel in your water. You know, what a lot of folks will do is they automatically think, well, we got great genetics, so we're going to have great results. The results are not predicated just on genetics. The results are predicated on habitat. They're predicated on the environment. They're predicated on the amount of food that you've got and the timing of that food. A 6-pound bass can go to 8.5 pounds in 1 year if it's got lots of 10-inch bass to eat. But those 10-inch bass can't get to 14 inches if there's too many of those that have overeaten that part of the food chain. So genetics is a piece of the puzzle, a real important piece of the puzzle. You are not going to grow a double-digit bass if you don't have Florida genetics, period. That ain't going to happen. Now, out of the other side of my mouth, there have been some northern strain bass documented to hit double digits, but maybe 10 pounds is about it. And those are exceptional fish that survived astronomical odds and had the perfect storm every day of their lives to get there. But, and frankly, I've heard of one of those that came out of Lake Merval in East Texas back in the early 70s before Florida bass were brought to Texas. So what I'm going to tell you is while genetics are very important, they're not the only piece of the puzzle. They've got to have the right size food at the right time. Now, here's where I'm going to go. For how many of you raised puppies before? Everybody has, pretty much. One thing you got to remember about puppies that's applicable to fish is if you have 6 puppies in the litter, you're going to have one that's the most aggressive, playful, eats the best, grows the fastest, and you're going to have a runt. Then you're going to have everybody else in the middle, you know, and that's the way fish are. Now, the caveat, when you first stock a lake, if you're, say, stocking 100 bass per acre that are good strain, Florida genetics, F1s, and I'm going to talk about the difference between those two in a minute. But you got to keep in mind that half of them are disqualified because they're males if you're trying to grow big bass. Males are not going to grow big. Females are. And out of those females, in your body of water, there's only going to be a certain percentage of those that can excel in your water or in your pond. It's going to be because that fish has the plasticity to command its environment rather than its environment totally command it. Which what that means is those percentage of fish figure out how to play the game with the amount of plants you've got, with the types of forage fish you have, with the behavior patterns of those forage fish compared to the behavior pattern of that bass or that handful of bass. So you're going to see a percentage, maybe 20 to 30%, that can really excel. Then the next 25 or 30% is going to be above average. The rest of them, the other half, they're going to be average or below average or non-performing or underperforming based on their behavior. Now, while they might have the genetics to hit 13 pounds and they're not aggressive, if they're passive and everybody else beats them to the food, you know, if they get the last piece of chicken, because that one over there doesn't get any because it didn't go fight for it, it ain't going to grow. You know, and so then you throw in another little factor that nobody really thinks about is what are the odds of survival of the best of the best? If the best of the best don't get an opportunity right out of the gate to eat well, grow well, hide well, it ain't going to make it. It's going to get eaten by something else, whether it's a great blue heron, a water snake, or another bass that's in that lake that's been there for 3 or 4 years, growing up at 10 inches long and eats it. You know, so your best bet at growing huge bass of best genetics is going to happen with that original stocking. So what Mr. Bell was saying is, should I add a few Florida bass into my existing pond? So I asked him some questions. He said, well, I stocked it with F1 tiger bass. Well, you know, those of us that do this for a living, a lot of times we don't think about what that really means. An F1 tiger bass is a cross between a pure strain Florida bass and a pure strain northern bass. And what the better hatcheries do, and I've been to American Sport Fish Hatchery a bunch, I know what they do. They verify the genetics of their fish. They pit tag those fish. They know them by name, and they freshen their genetics up every year or two by adding new known fish that they have tested to their herd, so to speak. So an F1 is a cross between a northern and a Florida strain bass. So what happens when you get that first generation cross, when those fish grow up and they start to reproduce, they cannot reproduce as what they are. So you get F2s, you get FXs, you get F3s, 4s, and 5s as you go down the line each year to year to year from spawn to spawn to spawn. You know, and so at some point you get to the point where the genetics are all diffused. Now, that doesn't mean that there won't be a percentage of those fish that won't excel. They will, given the opportunity, and they don't get eaten. You know, so when you start combining great genetics with the environment and the food chain that fish need to thrive, you can't just rely on genetics to get to where you want to go. So his question was, I think my genetics have been diluted after 6 years. Should I add new, fresh genetics? So the answer to that is you can. It does no harm. As a matter of fact, some of the hatcheries recommend, especially with F1s, that you add F1s about every 2 to 3 years just so that you'll have that F1 known coming into your system or coming into your fishery. So, and I'm a proponent of that. I like to see some F1s added every second or third year. That way you're not having to think about F2s, F3s, back crosses, FXs that might perform or might not. But I also want you to know that the disclaimer is that you can add those fresh genetics, but that doesn't mean that they're all going to survive. I'll bet you $100 they won't. But how many is enough? You know, if in his 2-acre pond, if he were to add 200 baby Florida bass and 90% got eaten, that means 20 of them grew up in a 2.5 acre pond and made it to adulthood. So some of those may have a shot at growing large, but what we do know is they'll also infuse their genetics. Now they can't, when you take F1s and you stock Floridas with them, you can't get F1s. Even when the F1s are spawning together, you're still going to get an FX, but there's going to be a higher percentage of Florida genes because that Florida bass crossed with those F whatever they are. And all it has is Florida genes. So there's my take on that. Now, when he stocks his brand new pond with bass, first of all, the red flag that went up to me, and I'm going to discuss this with him on a face-to-face meeting, is 2,400 bluegill in a 4.5 acre lake with 60 pounds of fathead minnows and 500 red ear, and you don't buy green bananas. That's not enough bait fish. It takes 10 pounds of bait fish for a bass to gain 1 pound. He's thinking he wants to put his Florida bass in this fall. Well, if he's putting in Florida bass that are 5 or 6 inches long with F1s, that's great. But if he's going to get fingerlings that are 3 or 4 inches long, those things have lost their first year's growth. He'd be better off to keep nurturing his food chain, let them excel, and then add bass next year that are spawning next year. Because that way he's not going to lose the time. Although, yes, he would have bass this fall, by about year 3, bass. Now listen to this. This is pretty interesting. By year 3, the bass that he would stock that were spawned next year would catch and pass the bass that he would spawn this year that didn't get to grow to their full potential because they were crowded in a hatchery pond. Okay, that's what I got to say about that. There's a lot more to talk about that, but that's a good starter, a good primer. Let me go back here. I don't want to miss all these questions. Let's see, my father-in-law and myself doubled up last night on channel catch Chuck Brinkman, 9 pounds, 7 ounces, and 8 pound, 10 ounces. Thinking they are stalling out on weight gain, so I think it's time for a fish fry. I'd say that's a good call. Now, if they're stalling out on weight gain, it's not because of the food they're eating, it's because they're competing for space. Although channel catfish are less notorious competing for space than other fish. So in other words, how many fish can you get in a gallon of water? That's that's where I'm going with that. In a small pond, if you've got 500 pounds of channel catfish competing for the same amount of feed every night and competing for the same amount of space, it's going to be just as much about space as it is fish food. Harrison Davis, how often do you recommend adding new bass to the team, and how many per acre and what size to get some diversity and better genetics? That's a great question, Harrison. I'm going to tell you if you do it every other year, and you don't mind spending 125 to 150 bucks per acre, add 100 bass, because you can buy them for like $1.25. Now the thing is you really want to get those bass bought from the hatchery as soon as they're available. And that's a question for the hatchery. And you need to be asking that question like in February and get on the list, because as soon as you can get some that are 1.5 inches to 2 inches, especially if you can get a head start on your bass that are spawning in your pond, if you can stock them before your bass are really coming off the nest yet, that's going to give the fish you stock a good advantage. So I'm going to tell you 100 per acre. I've seen guys stock them 20 per acre. I think the minimum should be 20 per acre up to 100 per acre. And that's going to depend on your circumstances, how clear the water is, do you have habitat for them to hide, and what kind of food chain there is. Dustin Crawley, do Florida strain bass tolerate warmer water than northern strain? Yes, they do. They like warm water. Florida strain bass love warm water. Northern strain largemouth bass don't like it nearly as much as Florida strain bass do. Florida strain bass are genetically programmed for warmer water, so they like it. Conversely, they don't like cooler water as much as northern strain bass do. Let's see, I seem to catch bigger bass this time of year in 8 to 12 feet of water. That's because they're looking for the prime temperature. Now, Florida bass prime operating temperature is the same as northerners. They like that 68 to 83, whatever it is. The difference is Florida bass are a little bit more tolerant of that 85, 86, 87 degree temperatures than northern bass. Northern bass don't like that 87, 88 at all. Matter of fact, I've watched them die in water that's warm where they couldn't escape it. Whereas the bigger bass don't like the pressure. No, it has nothing to do with pressure. They can adjust the pressure in their cells through their metabolism. They've got a device that regulates that. So they can let gas in and out of their cells and in and out of their swim bladder, so they can sit in water and the pressure doesn't affect them. Now, what it will do, if you catch a bass in 40 feet of water in a public lake and you pull it up, its air bladder is going to come out of its throat because of the pressure. It can't release the gases that fast, but over a long period of time, it can add and subtract gas, so that the pressure doesn't make any difference. The deeper I fish, it seems the bite gets smaller. That probably is because you're getting reaction strikes rather than feeding strikes. Because when they're down there deeper, they're not necessarily down there to feed. They're down there to not die. They're down there to survive. They're down there to seek the best temperature. Joe Marlowe, I'm losing water. Is it okay to pump water back in from the creek? Absolutely. I've actually done some due diligence for people who have ponds that are seeping, and come to the conclusion that the least expensive way to preserve that water that's seeping out, one I remember distinctly, we put a 500-gallon septic tank right below the dam and built a French drain where water would flow into that septic tank. Then he has an electric pump down there and a float, and when that float reaches a certain level, the pump kicks on and spits the water right back up into the pond. He runs it over a waterfall, and he's kind of made lemonade out of lemon. So yes, it is okay to pump water back in from the creek. Now, one little thought that's crossing my mind, sometimes, some situations when that water seeps, it's seeping through soluble soils that can inject different kinds of minerals and metals into the water. What I mean by that is it can change the pH. One thing I would do is I would check the chemistry of the water as it seeps out of the pond and compare that to the chemistry of the water in the pond and make sure there's not a drastic difference in pH and alkalinity especially. Lanny Davis, after a lake clean out, seeing lots of brim and have new spawn right now, but everything's small. The fish on the beds are about 3 to 4 inches long. pH and alkalinity were right on in early spring. What do you think they need? Vegetation is scarce, and you know what they need? They need time. Now, here's what's happened, Lanny, is when you stock those bluegills, a number of them grew up to where they could become sexually mature. Nature does not like voids. So if there's space and adequate food, nature wants to fill that void if there's not enough in there to eat it. So if Luby's cafeteria is packed full of food, they want more people to come in and eat. It's the same thing in your pond. So if there's more space and more food, nature is going to compensate by having many more spawns. So since there weren't any adult bluegills in there, those 1.5 to 2 inch bluegills that you stocked have now grown up. Some of them, the best of the best, have grown to 3 to 4 inches long, and they're spawning. Now, here's the good news, is you're going to have a bunch more baby bluegills coming on up the pipe. The bad news is those 3 to 4 inch bluegill probably aren't going to get a lot bigger than that. But the good news is they're going to guard the nest and make younger fish come up and pass them up. So over the long haul, you'll have bigger bluegill. But right now, what you need to do is just be patient. If you're feeding the fish, keep doing that and let the pond evolve, because that's what's going on. You've done it right, and it's going to go. Let's see here. Mitchell Jordan. I have been feeding my brim with the Purina Game Fish Chow. Does the Aquamax MVP make that much of a difference? It absolutely does, and I'll tell you why. Also, what do you think about the Aquamax Largemouth? I helped develop the Aquamax Largemouth, but I'm going to tell you this. Aquamax MVP compared to Game Fish Chow is like comparing donuts to steak. The Aquamax MVP makes those fish grow larger, faster, because it's fish meal based. So it's got a different source of protein than the Game Fish Chow. Game Fish Chow is more for folks that want to attract fish and supplementally feed them, but allow them to make their primary living off of what's growing in the pond. If you really want to grow some big bluegills and increase the mass of bluegills, or whatever fish you've got on feed, that MVP is a much, much better feed for faster growth rates and more productivity in the water. Aquamax Largemouth, I love it because the fish get better bang for the buck. So in other words, those big pellets are about as big as the tip end of your thumb. Those big pellets, when a bass, there goes an ambulance out here in the country, but it's not running hot. I don't know if it's making a pickup or a delivery. Oh, well. So, anyway, did he really say that? So, what Aquamax Largemouth does is it allows you... I'll tell you, here's a cool story. When Dr. Mark Griffin was working to develop that fish food, and I'll save this long story for later because we're going to run out of time, but he and I were talking about it, experimenting with it. He had come to the conclusion that a largemouth bass, when it feeds, is going to strike 7 times. Now, I don't know where he came up with that, and I don't have any reason to dispute it. He's got a PhD in fisheries stuff, nutrition and things, so I don't want to debate that. But what his point was is if he can provide more nutrition per strike, then he's going to get better weight gains. And in fact, that's what's happened. You can when you're feeding feed-trained largemouth bass, the Aquamax Largemouth pellet, you can see how aggressively they hit that feed compared to other feeds, and they get a better bang for the buck. Now, one thing that you got to know is there's not many feeders out there that will throw that feed out, so you're going to be feeding it by hand. One of the things Bill Cody came up with, Bill Cody's from Melinta, Ohio, he likes to take that fish food and soak it in water a little bit before he feeds it. That way it's softer going down the throat of a bass. So that's one little tip that I thought was pretty cool. Robert Hudson, I read that a 2-acre largemouth bass bluegill pond is too small to stock threadfin shad for forage fish. What's your opinion? No, it's not too small to stock threadfin shad. It's a little small for threadfin to thrive and excel and reproduce enough to sustain a population. They really need bigger water than that, but that would not keep me from trying it to see if it works. I've had plenty of small ponds where we've stocked threadfin shad that you could see a measurable difference. I'll tell you what threadfin shad do. Threadfin shad feed the 10 to 14 inch bass. So if you've got a pond where you're starting to get crowded with 10 to 14 inch bass and you got a few big ones, threadfin shad can be a good addition. Now, if you're crowded with bass and you can stock tilapia in the springtime, that might be a better bang for the buck because tilapia can survive well and reproduce a bunch and increase survival rates of bluegills. Adam Chandler's back on. Dustin Crawley, what about the F1? The F1, like I said earlier, is a cross. Okay, I tell you, here's the F1. The F1 is designed to have the best of both parents. So from the Florida strain, that means to grow to larger sizes. And from the northern strain that's the parent, it's more aggressive with faster growth rates. Northern bass grow faster and are more aggressive than Florida strain bass. Florida strain bass live longer, aren't nearly as aggressive, and get a lot bigger. So you get those traits all mixed into the F1. So the whole purpose of the F1 is so that you can have fat fish that are aggressive and easier to catch. Florida bass are not easy to catch. They're not. They're fickle. They're finicky. You know, I used to make fun of some of my customers because we'd go shock up these 10 and 12 and 13 pound bass and they couldn't catch them. Well, I just say, you suck. You need to learn how to fish. But the reality is that's not the case. Some of these guys are great anglers, but until you can figure out just how finicky and how a Florida bass feeds, because they're way more cautious than a northern bass. You can throw a jig right in front of a northern bass, it's going to nail it. But you throw it in front of that Florida bass and you move it, it ain't going to touch it. And finally, you twitch it a little bit, you're finally going to get his curiosity after about 30 seconds, and it's going to come and feed. Now, when a Florida bass eats, it typically eats big. You know, a 10-pound bass doesn't eat a 3-inch bluegill unless it just happens to be the perfect setting at that moment. So, there we go. Jacob West, this Facebook community is growing. Views are consistently at 80 plus. That's cool. Palm Boss is the top leader for fisheries information. Go, Jacob. Thank you very much. Danny Mac, so I admit I want to improve the genetics of my 10 northern bass bought out of an aquarium on eBay 2 years ago. You know, let's see here. I bought 23 to 5-inch crossed young'uns, 14 into the pond, which also had a bass spawn about the same size, 6 into our little koi pond. The ones in the koi pond chow down on small fish and look to be about 7 inches. Not sure how I'll ever catch those. As small as that pond is, you can catch it with a net. Mark Hicks, how often will fathead minnows and mosquito fish spawn per year in central North Cackalack in a new pond with no predator fish? Fathead minnows, Mark, will reproduce about every 30 to 45 days, depending on temperature. But the good news, even better than that, is the babies start having babies when they're about 60 to 80 days old. So their numbers, even though it's not as exponential as a pandemic, it's not far behind. So the numbers can increase. And as a matter of fact, when a male starts making a nest, he'll spawn his little patch of eggs, which are about as big around as a silver dollar on the end. Now, be sure you have some good firm objects where fatheads can get underneath to lay their eggs. If you don't have that, you're not going to see the spawn rates. They need to spawn on something firm underneath, like pilings of the dock, rock piles, pallets, pieces of PVC pipe that are 4 or 5 inches in diameter. So if you've got that, they're going to spawn a lot. Now, mosquito fish, they're live bearers, so they don't breed nearly as much, and you're going to see those around the edges. They're not significant as a forage fish for game fish populations. The fathead minnows are even way more significant because they're the ones that jumpstart the first year's growth of your game fish. So let's see what else we got here. I'm going to run out of time. Alan Andrew Williamson, I live in South Alabama, and last week you said not to fertilize after the water temperature reaches 82 degrees. I started fertilizing in March, and I've also heard don't stop fertilizing until the fall when the water temperature starts getting cooler. No, my opinion is this. Stop fertilizing when you have a good bloom and let that bloom run its course, because the risk of having a big bloom this time of year can be catastrophic. I was talking to one of our longtime friends and Palm Boss subscribers, Larry Houston. He's looking at his lake out in West Texas that is 35 acres and has evaporated down 4 feet. He couldn't get a bloom, so he fertilized it, didn't get a bloom, fertilized it again, got a bloom. Evaporation hit, started taking the water level down, and now he's got a bloom that's at 13 inches, and the water temperature's in the upper 80s, lower 90s at the surface, and he doesn't have aeration. So now he's worried that he's got too dense of a bloom, and he's going to need to treat it with some algicide to thin it out, which he probably does need to do that. I don't like fertilizing through the summer months. I like fertilizing in the spring and early summer and get that bloom in place and then let it run its course. And here's why. We're going to take a little bit extra time to talk about that. When you've got a bloom in the springtime, you've done two real important things. Number one, you provided the food chain for your newly hatched fish. And they need that, because when a fish is first hatched, it has no fat. If it doesn't eat, it's going to die, and its mouth is tiny. So think about that. A plankton bloom helps provide the food. The second thing it does is it blocks the sunlight off the pond bottom, which minimizes the risk of too much rooted aquatic plants. And if that bloom can move into June, toward the end of June, the 1st of July, and then begin to dissipate, you don't have any more spawn, so you're not worried about feeding small fish. If the water clarity increases, the risk of a fish kill from a dense plankton bloom consuming too much oxygen through the night or crashing and consuming too much oxygen through decomposition, you're going to minimize your risk for an oxygen crash that kills fish. The second thing is if you put off rooted plants until the end of June, 1st of July, that's a home run. Go ahead and let some plants grow, because now you got baby fish that are growing up. And those baby fish need a place to hide so they don't get eaten too much. So that's my opinion about that. Let's see here. Skook says, I'm 100 miles south of Canada in Minnesota. Could I do a perch-only pond? You bet you could. Any management tips to consider? Yeah, you know what? I would be ready to control their population. Probably in Minnesota, I'd be using walleye and a few smallmouth bass to help mitigate their high productivity. Now, in Minnesota, you know, they don't want you feeding fish. So one thing you're going to have to do is you're going to have to manage your water quality and manage your predator-prey relationship to get the sizes of yellow perch. But you are definitely going to need some predators in that quarter-acre pond. Tim Woods watching. Good to see Tim. Hey, there's Troy Goldsby. There's a couple of other superstars in the pond management business. Let's see what else we got. Dustin Crawley, thanks for the info. There's near Chickamauga Lake. That's cool. Yeah, lots of big F1 tigers. Travis, good show. Thanks a lot. Channel catfish aren't bottom feeders. No, they aren't, Justin. They're not bottom feeders. They're opportunistic like a teenager. They're going to go to the refrigerator. They're going to eat meat if they can find it, but if they're hungry, they'll eat broccoli. Really good clarity from your truck. Thanks for all the great info. Thanks a lot, guys. It's 7:31. I'm going to wrap it up. Let me see. I think the bullhead seams with channel cat seem different. Yep, okay. Let's see here. Mike Cottrell, good deal. Yep. Oh, yeah, Walden's got you some fish food. Good stuff. That's great. Chris Chavetta checking in. Good to see Chris. Jay Spires. Are all F1s the same? The answer to that is genetically yes, but environmentally no. And you can go back and watch the first part of this because I've explained some of that. Should I stick to my guns and recommendations to purchase at American Sportfish? I'll tell you this. I know American Sportfish, and I've worked with them for a long, long time. And in transparency, they bought my pond management company, and I totally believe in them. And even before these guys that own it now came on the scene, I know how they pick their brood fish. Now, that's not to say other people don't, because I'm sure they do, or they wouldn't stay in business. But stick to your guns. Be confident in what you're doing. Let's see here. What else we got? Higher protein fish meal, the better. Yep, there we go. Fred Bingham's back on. Brock Wren, will stocking 25 pure Floridas in a 10-year-old 10-acre lake grow 13-pound plus? You know what? If they get a chance to live and the best of the best survive, Brock, the answer to that question is yes. But there's so many things against a 10-year-old lake to automatically expect that it can grow some 13-pound bass. If it hasn't done it yet, there's reasons for that, and you need to be sure those reasons are not genetic. And we can have a conversation on that later. Let's see here. Danny Mack says baby bass will line up along the shore to gobble up the gambusias. Well, they sure can. Hey, listen, 7:32. Gosh, what a great show for you guys to come on and ask these thoughtful questions. I do deeply appreciate it. Remember, Pond Boss, go to pondboss.com. We're currently growing 10-pound northern black bass. If you are, you need to email me, because I got some people that are going to want to talk to you about that, because that's not common. 10-pound northern black bass are not common. This is my 41st year. I've never held one. I've never seen one, and I'd want to talk about it. So, hey, listen, thanks for coming on, watching the show. Next Wednesday, I think I'll be back at home in the office, and I'm working on some cool stuff. So, until then, I'm going to bid you farewell and say adios. See you next Wednesday.